the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Thursday, July 16th, 2015. We'll go live to Mexico City today to speak with Ioan Grillo, author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency, about the recent repeat escape of drug kingpin El Chapo Guzman. And the next episode in the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum features Stephen Kinzer, plus a video of a brutal police beating of a young man named Tyree Carroll in Philadelphia has emerged. We'll speak with Margaret Prescod, national coordinator of the Justice for Tyree campaign, and Tyree's grandmother, Nancy. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. Hi, Chenjerai.
Hi, how are you doing?
Doing well, thanks for joining us. The Greek parliament has approved the harsh austerity package from European Union creditors with a vote of 229 to 300. As part of the deal, lawmakers set aside 50 billion euros of public assets to act as collateral for the new debt. As dozens of MPs from Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras' Syriza party abandoned him for the vote, riots raged on the streets outside the parliament, where people clashed with police and fires burned. Meanwhile, Germans, upset at how their government pushed Greece into a corner, also expressed themselves on the streets. Protests took place in over a dozen German cities this week. Greece's agreement with the EU sets into motion what even the IMF admits is an unsustainable debt burden. Chenjerai, isn't this basically not necessarily the end of the story? I mean, sooner rather than later, Greece will have a debt repayment deadline. It won't be able to make it, and this whole story will start all over.
It really does look that way. You know, if you look at this package, we see, adjustments to pensions, Greek pensions, which is kind of like something people like to focus on, in the Greek situation. But there's also tremendous cuts to social programs and really the whole neoliberal austerity disaster that is being called a social genocide. And youth within Greece and in Germany seem to recognize this. Just to focus on Greece for 1 second, 85% of those from 18 to 24 voted no on this bailout package. And so it shows like that this, the decisions that are made are completely ignoring this part of the population. In Germany, you see the rise of the Blockupy movement, and you can go to blockupy.org and learn more about how Germans are organizing against these austerity measures.
And then a day after GOP presidential candidate Donald Trump garnered the largest support among Republicans in a poll, he unsurprisingly found himself being hated by Latinos. A new poll by Univision finds that 70% of Latinos have a very low opinion of the businessman-turned-political candidate. A previous poll by Washington Post and ABC News found that 81% of Latinos disapproved of him. Trump has not shied away from making hateful and racist comments against undocumented immigrants from south of the border, claiming they're criminals and rapists. Now, Chenjerai, Donald Trump got 17% approval from Republicans, but the rest of that, 83%, was split between a very crowded field of candidates. Once the candidate field coalesces, do you think he will remain popular even among Republicans? And do you, by the way, see him as the Sarah Palin of the 2016 election?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that Donald Trump will not last as a leading candidate, because I think that Republicans will be savvy enough to realize that he's not going to be able to, ever have any chance of winning the presidency. But, thinking about this issue with Hispanic voters, Hispanic voters, Hispanic youth, and folks who are on a journey to citizenship, they're not just a demographic that politicians can't afford to ignore. They're at the center of the realities of what it means to be an American in 2015 and going forward. And the Republican Party is trying to appeal to these voters, and Trump's rhetoric really hurts that beyond his own campaign. So I thought that the statistic that half of the Republicans view Donald Trump favorably is really something that we should have to look at, because there's been a lot of joking about Trump, but we need to start to look back at the broader population that supports Trump and realize that maybe he's actually not just simply a clown, but tuned into some very disturbing attitudes.
Finally, President Obama, during a trip to Oklahoma City this week, was greeted by dozens of protesters, about 10 of whom were waving Confederate flags. The incident came less than 2 weeks after South Carolina voted to remove their Confederate flag from the grounds of the State House after the Charleston terror attack. President Obama is in Oklahoma to visit the El Reno Federal Correctional Institution, It is the first time that a sitting president has ever visited a federal prison, and the visit is part of the president's criminal justice reform agenda, which he explicitly addressed at the NAACP conference earlier this week. Also today, Dylan Roof, the confessed perpetrator of the Charleston massacre, will appear in court to be indicted. He faces 9 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 1 count of weapons possession. Chenjerai, do you see the waving of the Confederate flag at Obama part of the same spectrum of hate that the flag-waving Dylan Roof is on?
Well, I like that idea of a spectrum of hate. It would seem extreme for me to try to, connect someone like Dylan Roof, a mass murderer, to average, everyday white Americans and Americans who are flying the Confederate flag. The majority of them do appear to be white. But what we have to start to ask is, what are those connections? I mean, Dylan Roof did go to high school with Lindsey Graham, a politician here in South Carolina. And the Confederate flag, this investment in emotional attachment to the Confederate flag, which I witnessed in person as the flag was taken down last week in Columbia, there were people out there holding the flag. So what are people invested in emotionally? What kind of hierarchy? We have to ask these questions.
Chenjerai, thank you as always for your analysis, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
My guest is Chenjerai Kumanyika. He is an assistant professor of communication studies at Clemson University. This is Uprising. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The world was stunned last weekend when Mexico's top drug kingpin, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, engineered a stunning prison break. It was the second time that the world's richest drug trafficker had managed somehow to escape the clutches of Mexican authorities. He had supposedly slipped out of a prison by hiding in a laundry cart the first time. 14 years later, U.S. and Mexican authorities re-arrested Guzman, who heads the Sinaloa cartel. The February 2014 operation was a complicated one, months in the making. And when El Chapo was arrested last year, the U.S. requested extradition, worried about another escape. But Mexico refused. According to AP, Guzman escaped last weekend via, quote, a sophisticated mile-long tunnel with ventilation, lighting, and a motorcycle apparently used to move dirt. The Mexican government just released CCTV footage of Guzman's last moments in his prison cell before he disappeared into the shower, never to come back. The escape is being seen as a major embarrassment for Mexico and could strain ties with the U.S. Joining me now live from Mexico City is Ioan Grillo. He is the author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. Welcome to Uprising.
Good to be here, Sonali.
Thanks for joining us. Well, Guzman is a billionaire. He's made Forbes' list. First, before we get into what's just happened, to set context for our U.S. audience who may not be as familiar with him, can you explain how he made his money and how much blood is on his hands?
Well, Chapo Guzman has been a drug trafficker all his life, basically. He grew up in a rough village in a state called Sinaloa in the Sierra Madre Mountains, where people have been growing opium and trafficking that opium to the United States for 100 years. When Washington, D.C. first made opium and cocaine illegal in the Harrison's Narcotics Tax Act in 1914, people in Sinaloa began to grow it and traffic it to the United States. So he grew up in this environment, and as he was growing up, the drug trade grew massively in size. There was first a marijuana boom in the United States in the 1960s, with many young Americans smoking marijuana and buying it from Mexico. Then there was the cocaine boom in the 1970s, with everyone taking cocaine in discos, and then people taking crack, on the streets. And then later on, he also got into trafficking crystal meth. So he makes this enormous amount of money trafficking drugs. He's head of one of the most sophisticated cartels of many Mexican cartels, who can move these drugs and can move the money through banks, through businesses, and around the world.
So he escaped through this tunnel. I mean, a tunnel is the most obvious way in which somebody would try to escape from a prison, let alone a maximum security prison. There's no other way for a prisoner to necessarily escape, either through tunnel or through somehow collusion from the prison guards just letting him walk out of there. He's either going to walk out of there or walk under from there. How embarrassed is Mexico and the Mexican government with what's happened?
I think the Mexican government is extremely embarrassed. It's a good point. I mean, tunnel is an obvious way. Everyone thinks of prison escapes as being tunnels. You think of prisoners with a toothbrush kind of making a tunnel, or a spoon or something. But actually, this was like done by engineers. I mean, it was a tunnel, as you mentioned, with electric lights, air vents, a motorcycle on rails, 1.5 kilometers or 1 mile long. So this was a very sophisticated operation, and it went exactly to the point where Chapo Guzman was in his cell. He was in a cell, and he had a shower unit with a blind spot. He had a CCTV camera in the cell. The one blind spot was where the tunnel went to. So perhaps they had some kind of GPS system there. So the Mexican government is extremely embarrassed. When they caught Chapo Guzman in February 2014, there was a lot of pressure from the United States to extradite him, saying there are problems with Mexican security. And Mexico was very adamant to saying, no, we should keep him here. We should take care of our own problems. And this is a very much kind of a shame on the Mexican government, and a sign of kind of weakness, internal weakness.
Now, the surveillance video of El Chapo Guzman's last moments in the prison shows, sort of a comfortable room by prison standards. He must have been in that room for quite a long time for the tunnel to be aimed so well into this tiny shower from below. The builders of the tunnel must have had blueprints for the prison. And it's also really interesting to wonder, was his cell not being examined every day, or at least regularly? And if it had been examined, even the blind spot missed by the CCTV, should have been something that was checked, which all leads to the question of how much collusion has there been from prison guards. I understand at least one person has been arrested.
Yeah, the question of corruption and of the activity of prison guards was in everyone's mind from the beginning. Mexico is an extremely corrupt country. I've been living and working in Mexico for 15 years, following the issue of drug cartels. And there's extraordinary stories you see all the time. I mean, I've met police officers who seem okay, and then the next thing, they've been arrested because they've been decapitating people. There were other prisons. There's another prison in northeast Mexico when prisoners would actually leave the prison with guns from the prison guards, kill people, and return to the prison to sleep. So, I mean, absolutely incredible, extraordinary things that happen in this country. This was meant to be different. This, the Altiplano, as it's called, was meant to be the #1 high security prison, like the Supermax in the United States. You have in the United States in Colorado, there's Supermax where you have people in the desert held in these solitary confinement. It was meant to be like that, and it failed. They took 34 prison guards and various officials in for questioning. Some of them are still there. About 28 or so are still there being held. They haven't been charged yet, but they've been kept, in cells and being interrogated. So we'll see what happens there. The question is how high up it goes. Was it only prison guards who were in on this, or was it higher up the scale?
Right, and there's some other indications about that as well. The New York Times reported that when Mexican authorities captured Miguel Angel Trevino Morales, the leader of the Zetas cartel 2 years ago, there was a lot of chatter and communication between cartel members after that as they reorganized and regrouped, which represented more opportunities for capture because police can pick up on those. And that happened. But when Guzman was arrested last year, there was a similar chatter picked up by intelligence, but very few secondary arrests. asks, could the Mexican government be deliberately allowing the Sinaloa cartel in particular to operate with impunity? Because there's a sense that the Sinaloa cartel, the sort of old school mafia don type cartel, has been able to keep, in greater check the violence that the newer cartels like the Zetas have just unleashed.
Like, Mexico is extremely corrupt, and I think everybody agrees, even government officials agree, that corruption is a major, major problem. The issue of corruption, though, gets complicated. Exactly how it works, who's working for who, how money is being paid, what they're being paid for, and so forth. If you look back at the 20th century in Mexico, from 1929 till the year 2000, you had one single party in power here, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Even though, bizarre name, Institutional Revolutionary, but that was the name.
That's the PRI.
Yeah, the PRI, the PRI. So the PRI were in power for all this time. And they, I think it's very established now that during that time, they controlled drug trafficking. So that in certain areas, certain people were allowed to traffic drugs. They were given like a license to traffic drugs almost, as long as they paid their money up to officials and the money went up the system. We have this metaphor that the money rises up like gas and the power flows down like water. That's kind of the way you have this in Mexico. And if anybody wasn't playing ball in this system, they could be arrested. And now and again, the government could arrest big traffickers to show who was boss. However, in 2000, we had this great thing happen in Mexico. Democracy was born here. That was when I arrived in Mexico. In fact, the day that President Vicente Fox took power in the year 2000. And people really hoped democracy, people will start being honest, we're going to get prosperity, it's going to be like the United States, or like this, the kind of dream of free market capitalism. And it didn't happen. People were still corrupt. There was still an enormous amount of poverty and even more violence. And the thing in the democratic or multi-party democracy that we've had for the last 15 years here is that you have different officials and different political parties working with different cartels. So you might have one police force or one police officer working with the Zetas, another working with the Sinaloa cartel, another working with La Familia Michoacana, and even the police sometimes break into fights with each other. Now, the Sinaloa cartel, being the oldest and richest cartel of all, obviously has better reach with Mexican officials. And like you said a good point there, that the Sinaloa cartel present themselves, and I have interviewed members of the cartel and members of various cartels and various gangsters in this region. The members of the cartel present themselves as being old school. We don't hurt ordinary people. We care about making money to look after our people, to look after our family. If the Americans take drugs, the Americans take drugs. But other cartels like the Zetas, as you mentioned, is led by former military guys, are carrying out massacres and very horrific antisocial crime. So there is some bias, I think, in some officials that, they're a lesser evil. Right. And there's times, the Zetas, for example, in 2011, burned down a casino and killed 52 people who were playing in the casino. They carried out a massacre of 72 migrants from Central America and South America who were heading through Mexico to go to the United States. They shot them all dead, 72 migrants, including a pregnant woman. So when you, against that, you think, we have to have a priority of going after the most violent, antisocial cartel. So it gets a difficult situation, even for somebody who's an honest government official or an honest person. How do you tackle this situation? And it may be a metaphor, maybe a complicated metaphor, but a complicated comparison could be when you have the situation in Syria with the Islamic State on one side and the Assad government on the other side. Should you go against the Islamic State? Are you then going to ally with the Assad government, or what should your position be there?
And of course, ordinary people are always caught in the middle with not that many constructive choices. Let's talk about what has really impacted ordinary people, symbolized, I think, most prominently by the massacre of 43 students last year, the famous case of the 43 missing students who were then, of course, found to have been killed in collusion between local government and a local drug gang. This was seen as Peña Nieto's biggest challenge of his presidency before Guzman's re-escape. Now that might be his biggest embarrassment and his biggest challenge. But do you see that incident and the drug cartels and Guzman's escape, even at the highest levels, as connected? I mean, how seriously are these incidents part of the same framework that we see within Mexico?
Yes, I think that's a good point. I think there's obviously a connection in all of this. Like I said, I've been covering this for 15 years now. I came from England, where I saw the other side. I saw the drug use in England. People taking drugs, the same as take drugs in California and the United States a lot, and not really seeing where the drugs came from. And then arriving in Mexico, you see the other side of the coin, a country with massive drug production and massive drug trafficking. Now, covering this, I covered this for several years, and it was kind of a local story. It wasn't such a huge international issue as it is today. But then from about 2008 onwards, you started seeing the violence reach a whole new level. And I think many of us covering this realized this is no longer a story of cops and robbers. This is no longer just the police, chasing guys in sandals, in flip-flops, with guns. This is now like a kind of low-intensity armed conflict. We're seeing groups, you see these, I'm sure you've seen images of these groups of gunmen with metal helmets, bulletproof jackets, AK-47s, even rocket-propelled grenades. These are the kind of guys, they're no longer guys with shaved heads and tattoos. These are real, paramilitary units. And into this equation, you've also got the Mexican army, the Mexican federal police, then coming in. So we've got this escalating clash in Mexico, which suddenly, I remember a scene in 2008, arriving in a town where there'd been a massacre by these cartel gunmen who come in and shot dead a bunch of people, including some kid on the street who was nothing to do with anything, just saw him and shot him dead. And everyone in this town, a small town, they were packing up their things in pickup trucks and leaving like refugees. And then you've got that across Mexico, refugees, thousands of people leaving because the violence was really affecting them. So you had this weird undeclared war in Mexico, which neither the government could really define or create a consistent policy of how to deal with this. And this really impacting human, regular humans, ordinary people.
Well,
So,
Ioan, let's talk about what often doesn't enter this conversation, and that's the role of the United States. The U.S. has been cooperating and would like to cooperate much more with Mexico to arrest drug lords like Guzman, but that's not the only part of the equation. The U.S., of course, props up Mexico's so-called war on drugs with millions and billions of dollars, and the cartels and their impunity and the military's impunity, all of that happens and operates, and the corruption in the Mexican government happens and operates within the framework of massive U.S. spending and support. Even if this particular escape by Guzman may be straining U.S.-Mexico ties in the present, historically, hasn't the U.S. also played a negative role in propping up a government that, that plays both sides of this war?
Sure. Just very quickly finishing the last point about the human rights disasters, and you mentioned the Ayotzinapa students. In this armed conflict, low-intensity armed conflict, with crazy things happening, corruption, so armed forces who sometimes are corrupt, sometimes just being repressive, but also genuine threats from paramilitary cartel groups, you've had a human rights disaster.
Yeah.
And we've seen, officially more than 83,000 people die, since 2007. It might be many more. We've seen more than 20,000 disappear, and many massacres of innocent people, many stories of innocent civilians being caught up, targeted for all kinds of reasons, and killed. Now, the United States is knee-deep in this conflict and has been, forever. This obviously has its roots in the United States drug use. So in the United States, people consume more illegal drugs than anywhere else in the world. the White House has a survey every year, and it estimates that they spend about $100 billion every year on illegal drugs in the United States. Marijuana, crystal meth, although marijuana is getting more legalized, but crystal meth, cocaine, heroin. Now, that money has created the cartels and created this conflict. On the other side, the United States has been involved in creating the military strategy to combat the drug cartels. So it has supplied the Mexican government with Black Hawk helicopters, with other military hardware, wiretap equipment, and the United States plays this kind of espionage game through the DEA and all these crazy stings where it has people pretending to be drug traffickers, infiltrating cartels, and getting involved in this kind of crazy spyware. So the United States is in this at all levels. Now, the United States is angry right now about Chapo Guzman escaping, and that is fair. I mean, Chapo Guzman is a serious criminal, but the United States also needs to think hard about the bigger picture of where the strategy on drugs, on cartel violence is going.
Ioan, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and shedding some light on this issue. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
My guest is Ioan Grillo. He is the author of El Narco, Inside Mexico's Criminal Insurgency. This is Uprising. When we come back, Stephen Kinzer will talk about endless war as part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. As part of an ongoing series of interviews for the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we turn today to Stephen Kinzer to explore the history of U.S. interventionism in the name of national security. The United States has long held the view that the world is a mess and we need to fix it. But do we really know what's best for the rest of the world, or even have the means to change it effectively? Produced by Brave New Films, the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum features my interviews with a series of academics, journalists, and activists. Henry A. Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the U.S. He served under FDR during World War II and ran under the Progressive Party ticket for the presidency in 1948. He was known as a champion of the common man. My interview today is with Stephen Kinzer. He is a journalist, academic, and veteran New York Times foreign correspondent. He is a visiting scholar at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University, and he's written many books, including Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were not exceptions. How many countries has the U.S. invaded? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are fresh in our memories. After that, maybe Somalia, Kosovo, or Haiti come to mind. But the list doesn't end. Invasions and overthrows are common in our history, more common than you probably think. Joining me now is Stephen Kinzer, an award-winning foreign correspondent who has spent decades seeing U.S. foreign interventions up close in places like Nicaragua, Germany, and Istanbul for the New York Times. His book, Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, details U.S. interventions over the last 100 years. Welcome to the program, Stephen.
Good to be with you.
So when did the U.S. begin in its involvement promoting regime change? When did the U.S. start promoting regime change historically? And was the Cold War a sort of turning point in that history?
In essence, we've had three stages of our expansionism. First, we became a continental empire. And then, beginning around 1898, we transformed ourselves into an overseas empire. And then, in the period after World War II, we became a global empire. So in this sense, you can imagine it as a process that began early and continued right through our history.
How does our government keep from its people the truth of these bloody interventions that we've had over the years, over the founding of this country, all the way through to today. I mean, certainly there have been times in our history, such as when the Iraq War was at its worst, when the war became very unpopular. But by and large, Americans don't seem to see the reality of what we are doing in countries abroad.
When American leaders order and promote interventions in foreign countries, they're not doing it strictly in a vacuum. We have a consensus in this country that this is a good thing to do. The press promotes it. Both political parties are competing against each other to be great cheerleaders for foreign intervention. There's great economic pressure from the defense industry and others that rely on it. So it's a collaborative process. It's a mistake to say that there's a clique in Washington that has hijacked America. Actually, we're all complicit in this. We have this idea that the world is in a big mess because other countries don't act the way the United States does. We imagine that there's some template that we can impose on the world that will make everything better. And whenever they want to intervene anywhere, for whatever reason, they like to cloak their interventions in some kind of a nice-sounding rhetoric. We have gone from the policy of liberation, as we called it during the 1950s, onto democracy promotion. That might not be the real reason we're intervening, but Americans are very susceptible because of a combination of naivete and true idealism to such rhetoric, and I think that our leaders use it very effectively to promote their own interventions.
And yet we have supported and worked with so many undemocratic regimes over the years when it has suited us. So this rhetoric of democracy promotion is useful in some cases when it aligns with our interests, but we openly side with very undemocratic regimes, such as Saudi Arabia, to just throw out one example, when it suits us to do so, right?
We have our own definition of freedom. The definition we've evolved is that when a country is open to American strategic power and when it allows American business the freedom to operate as it wishes in a foreign country, then that's a country that has true liberty. That's a way you can say that, for example, Iran under the Shah was freer than it was under the elected government of Mossadegh, or Chile was more free under the Pinochet dictatorship than it was under the elected Allende government. It's true if you want to say that freedom means the freedom of American corporations to operate. So as long as we redefine freedom the way we wish, we can tell ourselves that freedom is the true goal and result of our interventions.
So that's why, for example, a country like Venezuela, seen as undemocratic, even though its citizens are very engaged in the government, but its economy is close to the United States or is nationalized, and that's something the U.S. doesn't like.
And I'd add another point to that. Venezuela is its own country. Venezuela is the product of a whole series of situations, like every country is. Venezuela's dealing with Venezuelan problems. Perhaps the Venezuelans are making wise decisions. Perhaps they're making foolish decisions. That's for Venezuelans to decide. It's not up to the United States to sit in front of a map of the world and decide which countries are going right and which countries are going wrong and deserve American intervention.
I'm wondering if you can explain for us how, over the U.S. history, it almost hasn't mattered who has been in the White House when it has come to foreign policy. We've had a fairly uniform trajectory of intervening in other countries' affairs, even if the language that we use to justify it may differ slightly from president to president. How much leeway does the commander-in-chief really have over U.S. foreign policy?
Every time I go to Washington, which is as rarely as possible, I'm impressed with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions in foreign policy. In order to participate productively in the foreign policy discussion in Washington, you have to accept 100 fundamental precepts and principles that shaped and continue to shape our foreign policy. Once you begin to dissent in any significant way, you fall into this syndrome of, as they say in Hollywood, you'll never eat lunch in this town again. There's a great desire to maintain this consensus in foreign policy, and any suggestion that we should step outside the generalized rules that have shaped the way we interact with the world over recent generations is treated as the germ of a frightful plague that has to be eradicated before it infects the entire policy process.
Given that today we have the ability to shine a greater light on these issues, we're living in an age where communication is so much faster, and more people see themselves as citizen journalists. Do you feel that there is hope for reform of U.S. foreign policy? Will there be a time when the U.S. won't be so invested in intervening in other countries' affairs?
I certainly would like to think there is hope for a change in the direction of American foreign policy. I do ask myself this question, however. The United States now seems to be, as a nation, a little bit more reluctant to intervene in the affairs of other countries. That's a reasonable result of our recent history. We've gotten two big punches in the face from Afghanistan and Iraq, and after losing two such important wars so decisively, I do think Americans are a little bit taken aback and not so willing to pursue this policy anymore. Nonetheless, I ask myself, is this a permanent change of attitude, or does it just mean that we've taken a few punches and when we get a little bit of smelling salt, so we're going to be back in the ring and return to what has been essentially a long-term policy that's lasted more than 100 years in our history? The verdict is still out, and I hope ordinary Americans, through what remains of our political democracy, will be able to influence the future course of our interventions and try to take a more prudent and conservative approach rather than taking the utopian view that the world is in big trouble and we know better what is good for the world than the world itself knows.
Well, Stephen Kinzer, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been great to be here. Thanks.
On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we're joined by author John Tierman to talk about the fate of civilians in the countries we attack.
The U.S. has never really implemented counterinsurgency successfully. If you're bombing, if you have these long-range artillery, if you have other operations that produce casualties, it's going to be very hard to convince the population that you're looking out for their best interests. So we have yet to see if counterinsurgency really works.
My guest for this week's edition of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum has been Stephen Kinzer, journalist, academic, and veteran New York Times foreign correspondent. He's a visiting scholar at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. He's written many books, including Overthrow, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll examine the Justice for Tyree campaign. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Every other day, film footage emerges in the U.S. of police brutality, usually aimed at black men. The reliance on overwhelming force to address simple things like traffic stops, petty theft, etc., has proven to be a disastrous policy for police in America. A group of Philadelphia officers are the latest to be implicated in the brutal beating of a 22-year-old African-American man named Tyree Carroll. The beating, which took place in early April, was videotaped by several neighbors in the area, and it shows Carroll on the ground pleading for his grandmother who lives nearby while being repeatedly punched, kicked, and possibly tasered by several officers who also yelled profanities at him. At one point, 26 officers are on the scene. Carroll's only supposed crime was riding down a one-way street the wrong way on his bicycle. Police also said he had in his possession less than a quarter ounce of crack cocaine. Carroll reportedly bit an officer as he struggled for his life. He suffers from asthma and was being placed in a chokehold, similar to what Eric Garner succumbed to in New York. The young man was shockingly then arrested for assault and remains in prison. Until the video of his beating emerged last week, the Philadelphia Police Department took no action. Now there is an ongoing internal investigation. Joining me in studio today is Margaret Prescod, longtime political and grassroots activist and the national coordinator of the Justice for Tyree campaign. She's been active for many years with the Global Women's Strike. She's the founder of the LA-based Black Coalition Fighting Back Serial Murders. And of course, she's also the host of Sojourner Truth, heard Tuesday through Thursday at 7 a.m. on KPFK Pacifica Radio. With us on the phone is Nancy Carroll, Tyree Carroll's grandmother, who's also active with the Global Women's Strike. Welcome to Uprising, Margaret.
Good to be back, Sonali.
And I'll turn to Nancy in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the video, which has been viewed at least 100,000 times, without which there would have been no evidence of what happened to Tyree Carroll. It would have just been his word against the police's words. How important is this video?
Really important. There are actually 3 videos. This was the clearest. The other 2 are pretty dark. And we think if this video did not exist, the people who know about this beating right now would not have known. And the city of Philadelphia would not even be paying any attention whatsoever to it. As of this morning, from what I understand, there are over 200,000 hits on the video, and that doesn't include the postings on websites like The Guardian or Huffington Post, etc., as far as Japan, as far as China. So this is a growing movement. It's gone viral. The Justice for Tyree campaign made a series of demands. There'll be a press conference tomorrow. The city had a deadline of tomorrow, of Friday, to respond to some of the demands. As of this morning, nothing has been heard. Tyree Carroll remains in prison, and we want him out as the very first thing to happen.
And we should remember, this happened on the 3rd of April.
That's right.
So he's been in prison after having been brutally beaten up since then until now.
That's right.
And until this video came out, the police department didn't even acknowledge that anything had happened.
And it's worse than that, Sonali. Apparently, he was taken to the hospital after the beating. He was not examined for injuries. They just checked him to see if he had any drugs on him.
But of course, the officer who
Right.
was bitten was probably treated.
Right, absolutely. So we are concerned now, the campaign, the family, that includes the family members, that the medical records from the hospital be released, but also any medical treatment that Tyree has had since he's been in prison to be released. He has asthma. It's very hot in there. It's an old prison. Temperatures go up to like 100 degrees. What happens if he has an attack? Yeah. We're very worried about his health and well-being right now.
I want to turn to Nancy Carroll. She joins us on the phone from Philadelphia, and she's Tyree's grandmother. First, welcome to the program, Nancy.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining us. Can you describe and explain what you went through when you heard what had happened to your grandson?
I was very upset. I didn't know about it. He was calling me, but I didn't hear him calling me. Maybe it's a good thing I didn't hear him. Because then I would have tried to get outside, which I can't walk, but somebody would have took me down the steps. And I would have tried to help him, so I probably would have wound up in jail along with him.
And did you imagine, you're a longtime activist yourself, did you imagine something like this would ever happen to your own grandson?
No. But the one thing I say, there's another black child beaten by the Philadelphia police.
Margaret, let's talk about the fact that he admits that he bit an officer and he thought he was going to die. And I think this is, of course, an important issue for us to bring up because Eric Garner, who didn't have a chance to defend himself because he was placed in a chokehold, did die. What do you think was going through Tyree's brain? He has asthma. I mean, was his vain attempt at saving his own life, did that manifest in trying to, do all he could, which was use his own mouth to stave off being killed?
He was trying to defend himself, and that's basically all he had. I mean, he was, in fact, fighting for his life, because anyone who has seen the video, it's remarkable that he didn't die or wasn't even more seriously injured, although we really don't know. We want x-rays to be taken. We know he has shooting pains coming up his legs, his headaches, his back, problems with his back right now. But you could imagine, I mean, Sonali, you and I are both moms. You have 2 sons.
Yeah.
Imagine having to go through that kind of situation.
Yeah.
It's hard. I mean, what would have happened if he didn't try to defend himself? I mean, there was Eric Garner, the young man who was killed in The Hague in Holland by the police there, that led to 3 days of rioting. He also died in a similar way to Eric Garner. And there was a third death, recent death that happened of a young unarmed black man in this same way. So luckily for Tyree, he did what he could to save his life.
And of course, people are not supposed to fight back against the police. And whenever you hear defenders of the police and police's actions, they say, well, if you just complied, just, kept quiet, save the anger for later, you wouldn't have ended up in this situation. But as human beings, isn't it a human right to defend yourself from being killed, whether it's a cop or not?
But the thing about it is Tyree did comply.
He did
They
comply.
stopped him. He was literally across the street from his grandmother's house, if you could imagine that.
Oh.
They stopped him, they said, because he was riding the wrong way on a one-way street. He stopped.
Which bicyclists do all the time, by the way.
Alrighty. He didn't try to run. He didn't jump off his bike and start biting people. He complied, and then he was attacked. That's what happened.
Nancy Carroll, the Philadelphia police are notorious for police brutality. They're the only police department in the country that has ever firebombed from the air a civilian home when they destroyed the Move House, killing a number of people. They're being investigated or have been investigated by the Federal Justice Department. So even though, of course, it's shocking that this happened to your own grandson, the police department in Philadelphia is clearly acting in accordance with the way they've acted for a long time, right? How often does this happen to other people in Philadelphia too?
It happens quite often. One time it's too many. And nobody's child should ever be put through a thing like that. Nobody should have to go through it. Whether it be white, black, or green, shouldn't have to bear that responsibility.
And did it surprise you when they then charged Tyree with assault and that he remains in prison? That the person who was assaulted is accused of and charged with assault, and who he assaulted is difficult to know because what started out as 3 officers ended up at 26. So who exactly is Tyree expected to have assaulted?
Yeah, Tyree is very small, so it didn't take that many officers to hold him and get him on arrest. It didn't take that many officers. You don't have to be beaten to make you go through stuff like that.
Now, Margaret, the video of Tyree Carroll being beaten immediately, to me, reminded me of the Rodney King beating in Los Angeles. I mean, it just has so many eerie and horrific similarities, and that set off so much anger in the community. At the same time, today we're seeing so many videos, and there's this fear that people are just being desensitized to black pain, which is also another question. It was hard for me to watch that video, but I forced myself to because I'm a journalist and I wanted to, have to see it if I'm going to talk about it. But I also fear being sort of desensitized to watching this young black man being just beaten and seeing video after video after video. I mean, we need to find a way so that these videos stop because the beatings and the killings are stopping, right?
Absolutely, and I think that is the goal of the Justice for Tyree campaign. It is to get Tyree out of prison immediately. It is for those 26 officers involved to be immediately removed. They are still getting paid. They're still out there functioning as police officers. That they should be fired, but at first they should be at least put on administrative leave right now, but also so that no other person, as Nancy said, of whatever race, but we know generally it's young black and brown men. A Native American woman was just killed in Chicago just last week, and in St. Louis a few days ago, a 16-year-old was shot in the face, a 14-year-old injured. I mean, this has got to stop, and I think that is part of the effort. And some people are desensitized to it, but I must say the number of hits this video has gotten was surprising even to me in just a few days. And people are outraged. And even mainstream media that have picked up on the story, as of yet, it's not hostile media. And I think it's because people are so shocked by what they see. There's no denying whatever they claim Tyree did, all right? And many of us feel that this crack cocaine was likely planted. They beat the hell out of him, so they had to come up with a reason for stopping him besides him riding his bike, right? There's nothing that anyone could do that would deserve that level of brutal, racist violence by the Philadelphia Police Department. And interestingly enough, President Obama was just in Philadelphia at the NAACP convention talking about criminal justice and these issues. That what he didn't address was the broken windows policy that leads to this kind of police brutality where the smallest incident is blown up in the way as happened with Tyree.
Right. He took up the issue of the criminal justice system after people have entered the system, and maybe he also has been addressing certainly like the school to prison pipeline. But of course, he hasn't crossed police. He has held back from criticizing police, which is what a lot of our elected officials do. The Fraternal Order of Police in Philadelphia, which is of course long vilified Mumia Abu Jamal, who was also from Philadelphia. John McNesby gave an interview to Newsweek, and he actually went as far as to say this is good policing. You're allowed to use force to effect an arrest. They took narcotics off the street and took the man off the street. Wow.
You know, I mean, how could anyone seeing that video say that it's good police action? And in fact, in the first hearing, the police admitted that they never saw any exchange of drugs between Tyree and anyone else. The sole reason he was stopped was because he was riding his bike. They recognized him, like a lot of the young people in the neighborhood. They claimed that he had a prior, right, for something very small. I mean, what he had a prior for, a small amount of marijuana. Imagine if you were in Oregon or some other place, or you were some white kid
person in
out in
Colorado.
the suburb.
Yeah.
Nothing would have happened. So for this, you heard the names they called him. You piece of you know what, and we're going to tase you and all. I mean, this is terror.
Yeah.
And it's a terror that has gone on in communities like Nancy's neighborhood. I've been there. I know what that neighborhood is like. There in Philadelphia, in Los Angeles, in Ferguson. And indeed, this Saturday will be the first protest calling for justice for Tyree. And people are questioning, is this going to be a long, hot summer from Philadelphia to Ferguson? Because Saturday there will also be a protest in Ferguson. There'll be a protest in New York City tying together the beating of Tyree Carroll, the recent shooting in Ferguson, and to say that this has got to stop. So it really will be a national day of action, and Tyree will be lifted up in those cities of others around the country joining in the demand for justice for him.
Right. And just to pick up on what you said, if they arrested him because they recognized him, he was riding down the street in a bicycle. He was obviously not waving around some packet of drugs, which is why they might have flagged him, to say, oh, look, there's a guy carrying drug, let's bring him over, let's apprehend him. He was first apprehended for no reason, and then they supposedly found something on him, planted or not, And so it always brings up the question, if you grab randomly any person off the street, what will you find in their pockets? But you're not just randomly grabbing. Police are not randomly grabbing. Okay, let's talk finally about the fact that there are a very specific set of demands, as you said, including getting the medical records. But also, is there any sense that you have that the city of Philadelphia and the police department is going to comply with the long-term issue of brutality? Because the Justice Department released a major report on policing, made specific recommendations for them to clean up their act, and they're still carrying on like this. So are they taking even federal oversight seriously?
They're not taking it seriously, and we want Loretta Lynch's Department of Justice back on the scene. We want the president to pay attention to this. He was just in Philadelphia to say, you are disregarding the guidelines that have been set out to you, and you're not taking seriously what happened to Tyree Carroll, that the whole world increasingly are being shocked by. So we'll see if by tomorrow morning they have made any progress in any of the demands, including putting these officers on administrative leave. We'll be introducing the legal team. He has a crack legal team right now that they are ready to go to get Tyree out, to get the charges dropped. And furthermore, for the city, the mayor has said, he has to respond to this. The police department has to respond to this. We want the Department of Justice to also respond to this. And this is part of a growing movement. This isn't going anywhere. And the Black Lives Matter movements, they now have groups in about 22 cities around the country. I'll be at their national convention happening in Cleveland next weekend. They have very much been involved in this. So has Hands Up United out of Ferguson. They're part of the daily check-in meetings that happen with this campaign. So people are in it for the long haul. This isn't just a weekend warrior kind of situation. And the protests on Saturday will be the first of many, depending on the response from the city.
Right. Finally, Nancy Carroll, what do you hope to happen to your grandson, Tyree?
I hope he get out of prison. Because he shouldn't have never went in prison.
Yeah.
And I hope, the pains that he's having go away.
Well,
it's just sickening.
I want to thank you so much, Nancy, for joining us today and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much. And thanks also Margaret Prescod, the National Coordinator of the Justice for Tyree campaign.
Thank you, Sonali.
This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our Assistant Producer and Technical Director. Christian Beck is our Production Coordinator. Kiana Turner is our Visual Editor and Research Intern. And Teddy Robinson is our Audio Engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our Social Media Coordinator. Our YouTube channel is at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kohatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.